Hello everyone, it's Livia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm finally getting around to making the second video to talk about my fact and fiction project for final year at university, The Incident, which is a short story inspired by Anne Lister, who I talk about in my other presentation video, my historical figure that I wanted to focus on for my final project, which was a short story, and I decided to focus on her very can't think of the word now, but her very sort of what is the word? Tumultuous, that's it. Tumultuous relationship with Mariana Lawton. When you read, if you ever get the chance to read Anne's journals, which I highly recommend if this sort of piques your curiosity about her, it's just full of detail and this sort of swinging back and forth between being so desperate to be with her and then acknowledging that Mariana is not a good match for her. And I think in a way for Anne, because she had such a strong personality, a very sort of forthright manner, I don't think anyone ever truly suited her because no one could match. She was like a woman born at the wrong time, and she just really didn't fit into the time period that she was born in, sadly, and she very much struggled to, obviously with no lexicon, she very much struggled to define herself, her sexual orientation, because there was no lexicon for lesbianism or anything like that. And it's just all the fascinating sort of analogies she has and how she very much thought herself of this like masculine, almost like a masculine persona, I guess you could call it, and she was very self-aware of like how she impacted women around her and how they enjoyed her attentions. And obviously Anne had multiple relationships with multiple women throughout her life. Like, it wasn't just, she wasn't very faithful, shall we put it that way. But in her defense at the time, no one, apart from her last relationship with Anne Walker, no one ever really was willing to remain with Anne. So in a way, she didn't really have much choice. Loyalty wasn't a part of the equation for her. And obviously Mariana and her were together way before that Charles ever entered the picture and messed everything up. But that was Mariana's choice because Mariana wasn't brave enough to fully commit to Anne. Which is something Anne could never really wrap her head around, which is kind of what I wanted to explore in the short story, because The Incident, as my short story is called, is focused on the very sort of pivotal, and bless Helena Whitbread for her doing all the translation work for the transcript of Anne's journals and decoding them. She did a lot of that work among other scholars, so we can actually know what Anne wrote about, but you really gain a sense of how much emotional turmoil that Anne goes through because of her relationship with Mariana. But The Incident is, Helena describes it as a very pivotal moment in Anne's relationship with Mariana. They never truly have the same feelings for each other once this incident occurs. Like, Anne still continues to see Mariana even when she ends up with Anne Walker in the end, but they never truly have the same passion that they once did because of this incident. But interestingly enough, in the real life version of what happened, to cut a long story short, Anne being Anne, she was expecting Mariana on a visit. Mariana was going to visit her via her carriage. She was going to Shipton Hall to meet her. Anne, being impatient, decides, I know, I'll surprise her. I'll walk miles across the Blackstone Edge moors to meet Mariana's carriage on the road. Surprise her. It's going to be a wonderful gesture. I'm assuming this is obviously just my personal interpretation, but I think Anne thought that Mariana would be moved by this. She wasn't. She was horrified, but I think in the actual real life version, Anne somehow manages, I don't know, my knowledge of carriages isn't that advanced, but there's like a back window and like these step things, and Anne somehow managed to climb into the back of Mariana's carriage and land next to her in the carriage. And I think Mariana either had a best friend, or no, I think it was one of Mariana's sisters she had with her. And obviously Mariana just completely goes off at her and is like, what are you doing? What are my servants going to think? What is the world going to think? Like, how can you? Because obviously it's defying all sorts of social conventions. And if Anne is expecting a social call from Mariana, she should just wait at her home. She shouldn't go out to meet Mariana in the middle of the path, let alone climb into her carriage to be with the one she loves. But very interestingly, in the actual journal entries, Anne expresses sorrow and she expresses remorse of her actions, which is very uncharacteristic for her, because throughout her diaries, Anne has a very strong narratorial voice. She very much speaks her mind in her journal, because that's the one place where she can truly be uninhibited. And that's not to say in her real life that she wasn't very outspoken, but her journal was the one true place where she truly could be herself and could truly let everything out without fear of the social repercussions of it. Although Anne also very much didn't give a toss really about what people thought of her. But to some extent she had to play by certain rules. So her journal is the one true place she can truly let out her emotions. So when I was reading the passage to do with the incident, and how she's apologising to Mariana, and how she's basically apologising to her and is very reserved, and I was just like, this isn't like you at all. It's so uncharacteristic. And I think that really detailed and showed how much Mariana emotionally hurt her by rejecting her in that moment. But what I loved about Fact and Fiction was it really encouraged us to, like, obviously, yes, you're basing your story on either a real historical location or a real historical figure, but the whole idea of fiction is bringing in that creative element and playing with it. So rather than sort of staying true to what actually happened, I decided to take a much broader scope of their relationship, because that incident is just such a tiny part of a lifelong relationship that these two women have had, and so much has happened leading up to this point. I mean, there are moments where you're like, you just want to cry out that, Anne, please find someone who's better for you, because there are moments where Mariana in the past has like really been made fun of Anne in front of their friends about Anne's sort of very masculine appearance and the way she dresses, because she would wear this like long black greatcoat, or I can't remember the actual correct name for it, or waistcoat. But she basically had this like black ensemble which was very masculine, and she would wear a top hat, which is portrayed very well by Sir Anne Jones in Gentleman Jack. That's literally what Anne would strut around Halifax in. Looking very dapper and very out of place. But there are moments where Mariana has, like, because Anne writes about it in her journal, saying how, you know, she's just making like a mockery of me, she's saying all these horrible things, and it's just really sad. And you can tell that even though Anne is trying to be stoic, she is very much, you can tell she's hurt by that. You can tell just in the way that Anne also in her journal obsesses over the clothes she wears, and she makes, like, she writes in crypt hand, which is her code. She'll write details about what clothes she wears in her crypt hand, so that shows that if anyone else was to come across this journal and didn't have her code, they wouldn't know what she was writing about. So it shows that on the one hand she had a complete disregard for what people thought of her, and then on the other she was also very concerned with how people thought of her. She was very much torn between two places, and all these other little details. And they have like a holiday to Scarborough where there's a lot of tension. So what I ended up doing for my short story, and literally this short story was hell to write. I loved it and hated it at the same time. In the beginning, I just couldn't get these first drafts right, and I'm very grateful to my lecturer for giving me such amazing feedback and believing in me to be able to actually produce this story, because I was having a moment. I was having a time with it. I ended up drafting it 5 times, so I think the 5th draft ended up being the final draft, where you reach that point where it's like, I can't write this story anymore. But I basically, for that final draft, I start off with the scene on the moors where they go and taking inspiration. I didn't worry about the chronology, the chronological events, I didn't worry about like the accuracy of that. Basically, I just took inspiration from Anne's different moments with her relationship with Mariana, and basically brought it all to a boil and let them just have it out on the moors. So Mariana sends her carriage away. She like alights from the carriage, gets down when Anne turns up. She sends her servants away to a nearby inn, and they have a lovely massive row on the moors, and just dragging up all their history, which was very cathartic to write. And it was in no way an attempt to discredit or disrespect the memory of Anne or what she experienced. But the fictional element, I wanted to give her her voice. I wanted her, all that pain, all the stuff she had to censor, I wanted it to come out. So it was very sort of cathartic and quite enjoyable to write. Just to like let them have it out, really. Especially because one of the details in the journal that Anne writes in great detail about and tries to treat herself for is the fact that because Charles Lawton, who is Mariana's husband, was having many affairs with other women, he passes on a venereal disease to Mariana, who then passes that venereal disease on to Anne. And then because Mariana's brother Stephen is a doctor, and Anne is very fascinated by medicine, she manages to discreetly go to him and pretends that it's a friend in trouble who has gotten in a bad way and needs assistance. And she basically injects herself with this concoction of different medical stuff, probably poison, and attempts to treat herself. And it's just, she goes into all these details, and I can't remember the fancy Latin name for it, but it was known as the Whites. And it was very... it was just quite a satisfying moment to bring up Anne's fiery spirit by making her very cuttingly tell Mariana what she thinks of her and referring to that particular incident and using it as an insult. And that's what I really enjoyed. And then the other aspects in the story I focus on are Anne's hatred, obviously, towards men. Because they treat her vilely. She's had Oliver Townsend, I believe his name was. It might be Oliver Townsend. I'm trying to go off memory. But there's this man in Halifax who I very much hate alongside Anne. Back in the day, back in the Georgian era, there was a custom that you could write sweetheart advertisements in the newspapers if you're out looking for a partner, someone you want to start courtship with. You could write a sweetheart advertisement. This vile man, decides it would be a hilarious joke because a lot of people just, obviously there was no word for lesbian, but they basically know of Anne, and they know that she's not to be trusted around women, and there's a lot of suspicion surrounding her because rumours and scandal and gossip, it all travels around. This man thought it would be a hilarious joke to post on Anne's behalf that she was looking for a man, basically posting in the one of the local newspapers, like, oh yes, Anne Lister of Shibden Hall was like looking for and there's a brilliant moment where, well, not a brilliant moment, there's a horrific moment where she's almost assaulted, and Anne fends him off. I can't remember if it is with an umbrella in the actual journal entry, but she's basically talks about how she fights back, and she was a very, very powerful woman, and she wasn't going to take rubbish from anyone. So all these little details I also explore in my short story, The Incident, and I have her actually symbolically burn these, like, she's received love letters from men, and she just doesn't care. So sort of, I have the scene on the moors first, then it goes back, and then she reflects on like the holiday to Scarborough, which I invented much more of because once again some of the details are more sparse in her journal entries, but I really explore kind of the ups and downs of their relationship. And obviously after that fight that they have on the moors, I have Anne reflect back and think, oh, she has hurt me before, and she's always been a very sort of temperamental, spirited woman. Like, she's always been a storm, like an unpredictable storm, and any moment she'll strike. So I very much explored that aspect of her relationship. And then the final part, the way I conclude the story, is that Anne's back at Shibden Hall, and she is reading through her journal entries and bringing up much more about the past, and how Mariana's one wish in life that she sadly never fulfilled was that she was desperate to have a baby. She was desperate to become a mother, and sadly that never happened for her. due to fertility issues. And we don't know if that's on Charles's side or Mariana's side, but sadly she could never have children. And she had plans that she was going to go out and solicit other men to give her a child. And Anne's obviously horrified by this, because it's like, oh, well, that kind of puts a bit of a damper on our relationship. But I also sense that Anne, probably that would have hurt her too, in the sense that she would acknowledge that she would never be able to give Mariana that. And that's something I explore, like this kind of regret that the one thing that Mariana truly wants, Anne can never truly give her. And then sort of in that moment of clarity, Anne realises Mariana doesn't love her as much as Anne loves her, which I still think is very true. When you read the journals, you really gain a sense that at the end of the day, Anne is very much obsessed with Mariana and loves her so much more, that like borderline obsession with Mariana, and Mariana doesn't feel the same way. She enjoys Mariana very much, uses Anne more as a kind of like, because she hates her husband, so you can tell that Mariana very much uses Anne for just sex and pleasure and passion, whereas Anne doesn't just use her for that. Anne truly wants to live with her, and they have such a long history, and it's very tragic. It's very sad how it ends out. But the final part is that she's going through all these journals, has this moment of clarity, and she writes Mariana an ultimatum, which is completely fictionalized. But what happens in real life is that Anne ends up moving to Paris for a couple of years before she comes back to Halifax. So I decided to take that as inspiration, and I have Anne write a letter basically giving Mariana a big ultimatum, and basically a very subtle sort of sexual innuendo or sexual euphemism, which was gooseberry bushes, which means pubic hair. So she basically talks about how, oh, I've tasted all the gooseberry bushes of Halifax. I've had my fill. I've quite had my fill. And she's basically saying how she's going to cross the channel, and and God and our Lord knows how long I'll be gone. So she's basically like, you have to make a choice. Either you want to be with me or you don't. And she's very curt with her, because she calls her, they call each other lots of different names. And in real life, Mariana would call her Jack, and my husband, Jack, she would call her Freddie, my husband Freddie. So she would refer to Anne as Fred, or Freddie, my husband. And Anne would also call her Mary. So in the letter, I have her address her as Dear Mary. And then the end bit is that I write it, but I have it crossed out, is that she says, if there's a corner of your heart that still wants to be with me, or wants to be my wife, elope with me to Paris. But she crosses that bit out, because knowing Anne was a very stoic woman, and even though that's what she desperately wants, she couldn't bring herself to write that. So anyway, if anyone's watched this, thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I just love fact and fiction. It was my favourite creative writing, probably one of the best creative writing modules I could have taken for my final year. Thank you. Bye.